Last night on national television, a political debate unexpectedly turned into a viral moment of truth, all thanks to Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. What started as a routine forum on economic policy suddenly shifted gears when she presented a single, powerful example that caught Senator J.D. Vance completely off guard. The event was unfolding in typical fashion, policy back and forths, familiar arguments, until Crockett calmly reached for a document and addressed Vance directly. "Before I respond to your statements on government assistance," she said, holding up the paper, "I want to highlight one real-life example from your home state." The moderator gave a nod. The studio went completely silent. What followed didn't just rattle Senator Vance. It cracked open years of political talking points and unleashed spontaneous applause from the audience, despite strict rules against audience reactions. Even the moderator didn't interrupt, recognizing that something bigger was unfolding. A moment rooted in truth, lived experience, and undeniable facts. If you're tired of political spin and want to hear what truly happened, hit that like button and subscribe. Because what Jasmine Crockett shared wasn't just a winning argument. It could very well reshape how America discusses poverty and government support for years to come. But to fully understand why this exchange exploded across social media, gaining over 20 million views in under 24 hours, you need to know who these two public figures are and what brought them to this televised collision. Senator J.D. Vance, 41, rose to fame with his best-selling memoir Hillbilly Elegy, which chronicled his difficult upbringing in Ohio and his path to Yale Law School. His personal story, grit, struggle, and success without depending on government support became central to his political brand. As a senator, he has repeatedly positioned himself as a voice for the working class, while pushing to limit federal assistance programs. In fact, he's become one of the most vocal critics of what he calls the culture of government dependency, often citing his own experiences to argue that success comes from personal determination, not from safety nets. In a recent Fox News interview, he stated, "I saw it up close. Government programs don't lift people, they trap them. What changes lives is responsibility and hard work." This message has formed the bedrock of his policies. But not everyone agrees, especially Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Now serving her second term representing Texas, Crockett came into politics after a respected career as a civil rights attorney. A graduate of the University of Houston Law Center, she made her name fighting against structural inequalities and advocating for underserved communities. Since taking office, she's built a reputation for backing her arguments not just with passion, but with data. Unlike many of her colleagues who lean into ideology, Crockett often brings up direct stories and hard evidence from the lives of everyday Americans. So when the National Economic Policy Forum aired live in prime time, centered around the growing wealth divide and debates over social programs, Crockett came prepared. Very prepared. While other participants brought rehearsed talking points, Crockett had spent weeks researching Vance's hometown, Middletown, Ohio. She gathered local statistics, tracked down first-hand accounts, and even interviewed people who remembered Vance's childhood. "This debate isn't about ideology," she reportedly told a staffer before the show. "It's about real people and real results. Sometimes one example speaks louder than 100 speeches." As the discussion turned to welfare and government support, Senator Vance launched into his familiar stance. "I've lived through it," he declared. "These programs don't help, they hurt. What changes lives is individual effort, not dependency." Then it was Crockett's turn. With the camera focused squarely on her, she began calmly. "Thank you, Senator Vance. I've listened carefully to your position, and I appreciate your personal story. But I'd like to offer something else, data. Let's talk about Middletown, Ohio, your hometown." Vance nodded confidently. This was territory he knew well, or so he thought. Crockett opened a folder. In 1992, when you were around 8 years old, Middletown launched a free school meal program. No income forms required. It removed stigma and made meals available to every student. She paused, meeting his eyes. This was funded by the very kind of government program you've opposed in the Senate. According to Ohio's Department of Education, she explained, the program reached 87% of school-aged children, including Vance himself, according to his memoir. You could hear a pin drop in the studio. She went on, placing documents on the table. Following the launch of that program, Middletown's high school graduation rates rose 18%. College enrollments climbed 22%. These are real, recorded improvements. Then, she mentioned a name that visibly shook Vance, Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins, a former lunch supervisor at his school. Mrs. Jenkins is 78 now. She still lives in Middletown, and she remembers you. She told me how, before the program, many kids skipped lunch to avoid the embarrassment of being labeled poor. Once that stigma was gone, attendance and academic performance improved, including yours. Crockett looked at Vance with calm sincerity. Mrs. Jenkins kept notes on student progress. Your name was on her list of those who improved. For once, Vance, usually articulate and self-assured, looked visibly shaken. But Crockett wasn't finished. Last month, Senator, you voted against the School Nutrition Enhancement Act, which proposed a program modeled on Middletown's. You called it unnecessary and said it promoted dependency. She paused, letting the weight of the contradiction land. The same kind of program that helped your classmates, and you succeed, is the one you're now trying to block for today's children. Her tone wasn't aggressive. It was steady, respectful, but unflinching. She continued, so my question is simple. How do you explain voting against programs that mirrored those which clearly had a positive impact on your community and your own life? The moderator let the silence linger. Vance opened his mouth, then stopped. For several moments, he had no reply. Finally, he stammered. Well, that program. Things were different back then. Today's proposals. I'm sorry to interrupt, Crockett said gently, but the legislation you voted against was directly based on Middletown's model. Page 17, Section 3. It even cites it by name. She held up the document with highlighted text. The camera zoomed in on Vance's face, the tension unmistakable. This wasn't theory. It was his own life story being used, accurately, to challenge his political stance. I need to review the specifics, Vance muttered, clearly unsettled. Legislation is often more complex than it appears. Crockett calmly replied, it's only 24 pages. I have a copy here. Turning to the audience, she added, this isn't about political attacks. It's about policy that works. We have the data, the lived experience, and in this case, a success story that deserves to be replicated, not denied. She concluded, this isn't about creating dependency. It's about creating possibility. The moderator, now visibly moved by the exchange, asked Vance for a final response. Senator, would you care to directly address the example the Congresswoman raised? Vance tried to deflect. Look, we can all cherry-pick data. The broader issue is, Senator, the moderator cut in, unusually direct. We're asking about your specific example, one from your own childhood. Can you address that? The audience leaned in. Vance hesitated. Then something shifted. You know what? He said quietly. Congresswoman Crockett clearly did her homework. She's right, that program helped. I haven't thought about it in years, but yes, Mrs. Jenkins was there. Those lunches, they mattered. His voice softened. I never connected the dots between that and my votes, but maybe I should have. There were days, Senator Vance began quietly, when that school lunch was the most reliable meal I had. And you're right, when the universal program began, the stigma disappeared. He paused for a moment, the weight of memory evident in his voice. Before that change, he continued, some kids would rather go hungry than use those colored lunch tickets that labeled them as poor. The atmosphere in the studio shifted. Heads nodded across the audience. People who had either lived that experience or watched their children navigate the same quiet shame. Congresswoman Crockett nodded back, not in triumph, but in recognition of the humanity in his admission. Thank you, Senator, she said gently. This was never about embarrassing you. My point is simple. Not every government program is perfect, and personal responsibility still matters. But the data from Middletown shows us something important. When done thoughtfully, support systems can be the very thing that lead people toward the self-sufficiency we all want for our communities. Recognizing the gravity of the conversation, The moderator allowed it to continue past its allotted time. Congresswoman, she asked, you mentioned speaking with Middletown residents. Did anything else stand out from those conversations? Yes, Crockett replied, reaching for another document. I spoke with Dr. Robert Putnam, who's done extensive research on Middletown. He found that the Universal Meal Program didn't just improve nutrition. It strengthened the social fabric of classrooms. Children stopped being separated by income. Teachers reported greater unity among students and fewer classroom disruptions. She clicked a slide showing a graph. After the program launched, chronic absenteeism dropped by 23% in just 2 years. Teacher surveys also revealed that behavioral issues during afternoon lessons fell by nearly 30%. These aren't just statistics. They represent real children who learned better because they weren't hungry or ashamed. Then she turned to Vance again. Senator, in your book, you talk powerfully about how a loss of community weakened opportunity in Middletown. This program, by creating unity among children, helped restore some of that community cohesion. The very social capital you wrote about was, at least in part, preserved because of a government intervention that worked. Vance leaned in, not defensively this time, but listening with genuine interest. I do remember that, he said quietly. After the change, it didn't matter whose parents made what. Everyone stood in the same lunch line. Exactly, Crockett responded. And the legislation you voted against last month mirrors that same philosophy. Universal access, dignity, and removing stigma so students can focus on learning, not shame. She displayed a side-by-side comparison. The old Middletown program and the new bill. The similarities are clear, same structure, same goals. The only real difference is scale. By now, something extraordinary was happening. The studio wasn't witnessing a political argument. It was witnessing a conversation rooted in respect, evidence, and truth. Across the political divide, the audience sat in rapt attention. Then, breaking the rules of the forum, an elderly man in the front row stood. I ran a school district in Pennsylvania, he said, and we implemented a similar program. She's right, it worked. Kids came to school more often, and they learned better. Rather than stopping him, the moderator simply nodded. 3 more audience members stood in turn, a school nurse, a teacher, a volunteer parent. All shared stories that reinforced Crockett's example. What had started as a debate was turning into a community testimony. As the camera swept the audience, faces reflected something rare in modern politics. Not division, but thoughtfulness. There was no shouting. No winner declared. Just a room full of people realizing that facts still mattered. The moderator, usually composed and neutral, seemed moved. In 20 years of hosting political forums, she said, I don't think I've seen an exchange with this level of impact. She turned to both guests. Before we break, would either of you like to share a final thought? Vance went first. I appreciate the Congresswoman for bringing forward a concrete example, he said. While I still have concerns about the structure of some programs, tonight reminded me that we must look at outcomes, not just theory, and that includes re-examining my own assumptions. Crockett nodded. Thank you, Senator. This is how progress happens, not by pretending we always have the right answer, but by listening to the facts and being willing to adjust when reality challenges our views. The segment ended, not with noise, but with something far more powerful: applause. Sustained, heartfelt, bipartisan applause. Some audience members wiped away tears, not because someone had won, but because, just for a moment, it felt like politics had become real again. The aftermath. In the hours that followed, the clip of the exchange spread like wildfire. Social media was flooded with posts using the hashtags #MiddletownExample and #CrockettReceipts. Within a day, the segment had been viewed over 40 million times. But this wasn't just a viral moment. It sparked something deeper. News outlets across the country began investigating the Middletown case. The Columbus Dispatch published a feature titled The Middletown Miracle, confirming Crockett's data and interviewing residents like Mrs. Jenkins. I watched children go hungry because they didn't want to be seen using a different lunch ticket, Jenkins told the paper. The Universal program changed that. They came to school with their heads held high. It wasn't about food. It was about dignity. Education experts echoed this. On CNN, renowned scholar Linda Darling-Hammond noted, "We rarely get longitudinal data like this, a local program that improved attendance, grades, behavior, and later success. It's not theory. It's proven." Surprisingly, even conservative commentators praised the moment. Columnist David Brooks wrote, "Congresswoman Crockett didn't win on style. She won on substance. A real example, real outcomes, real impact." As for Senator Vance, his initial office response emphasized his belief in self-reliance. But just days later, he published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. "I still worry about long-term dependency," he wrote. But Congresswoman Crockett raised a legitimate point. The Middletown model worked. "I've asked my team to study what made it successful." This wasn't a full reversal, but it was an acknowledgement. And in today's political world, that's rare. Crockett's national profile rose instantly. Invitations poured in from universities and policy think tanks. Her team reported receiving thousands of letters, many from people who usually wouldn't support her politically, but who appreciated her commitment to facts over rhetoric. The Washington Post editorial board put it this way: "Congresswoman Crockett didn't just challenge a senator. She challenged all of us to raise the standard of political debate." The long-term impact. Weeks after the forum, networks began announcing a new rule, what some called the Middletown Standard. Political guests would now be expected to bring at least one verifiable example to support any claim they made on air. And then, the biggest surprise of all, Senator Vance returned to Middletown. Local reporters noted that he met with Mrs. Jenkins and former teachers. No cameras, no press, just quiet conversations. Soon after, he introduced a bipartisan amendment to an education bill, proposing a pilot program modeled after Middletown's original plan. It would launch in 50 districts across the country. Crockett co-sponsored the bill. "This isn't about political victory," she said at the press conference. "It's about policy that works. And I welcome Senator Vance's willingness to reconsider positions in light of new evidence." 6 months later, the program passed with strong bipartisan support. The Atlantic called it a small but meaningful outbreak of evidence-based governance. 1 year after that forum, Stanford University released a major study confirming what Crockett had argued. Universal, stigma-free meal programs consistently improve student outcomes and promote long-term economic mobility. The study even referenced the Crockett-Vance exchange as the moment that reintroduced evidence into a policy conversation long dominated by ideology. But perhaps the most moving result came not from Congress or TV, but from a letter Crockett received from a young girl in East Texas. "I saw you talk to Senator Vance about school lunches. I get free lunch too. Thank you for making me feel like that's okay."